Pleasant good afternoon. Welcome, 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 welcome everyone to our community class. You may notice that the recording has been turned on for this community class as request of our guest speaker. So you can come on camera, you can stay off camera, up to you to do all of that. The session is being recorded. And we're very excited. And if what that some of you have heard that song maybe 10 times already from me for various issues, for various settings. Stand Up For You is one of my theme songs when it comes to the work that we do in advocacy, because that's what it is about, right? I stand up for you. It's very intentional about what we do in this work of equity, diversity, and inclusion. But what we do in teaching, I love to use a language very commonly, and I say to people, we're talking about other people's children. I use that language quite a bit as we talk about other people's children. And this evening in our class, for our community class this evening, in the course 5704, and the course, as you see on your flyer, because I see communities present with us, is we're looking at issues in urban pedagogy. Urban pedagogy. And this evening we had quite a bit of our students who presented, and they shared about burnout, teacher burnout. They share about issues in violence in school. We look at funding in certain programs. One of our students talk about autism and the funding and the issues. We talk about racialized bodies and how they're seen in class. So there are so many issues. But why are we here? Why do we gather to learn? And then we had in our previous group, we closed the afternoon with one of our student who has been teaching for 17 years. And so that level of experience came into the room, that level of experience. And it was a full of promise. What I loved about your Sonia's presentation was that it was clear that they were concerned about, and there were more questions. And I love that there were more questions than answers. There are more questions than answers. I teach another course, 5708, and I think I say a student from that course here as well. And one of the assignments for that course is to create critical questions. You do not need to respond to them or anything. There's a whole bunch of critical questions, because sometimes it's more important to have questions than answers. And when you have questions and you can sit into those questions, you really understand sometimes the answers will come to you. And so we'll talk about how do we get there. So this evening, we have a guest speaker, guest presenter, not a panel this evening, but we have a guest presenter, Dr. Kaschka Watson, newly minted Dr. Watson. And congratulations, Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson will be walking across the stage in a couple of days. And that's a celebration of who we are. And Dr. Watson and I wrote a paper on culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, something that you are doing. I see a lot of school educators here with me. I see you, community. I see you. I see educators. I see you. I see you. I see you. You know yourselves. And there'll be opportunities to share. I think Dr. Watson have maybe one or two breakout opportunities for us to also have conversations as well. So we're going to do that. So it's going to be over to you, Dr. Watson, as a PhD in educational leadership policy and diversity, right here at OISD in our Department of Leadership, Higher and Adult Education. And the research includes anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-colonialism, educational policy, diversity, inclusion, and equity, and social justice in education. And I'm going to hand over to you, Dr. Watson, to talk to us, present and share in an engagement on culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And then when you're ready for the breakout rooms, we will do that. Just be reminded, everyone, that the session is being recorded, but breakout rooms are not recorded. So whenever we go to a breakout room, we put the recording on pause. We do not, and I personally do not record breakout rooms. So you have opportunity and space to have discussions without we trying to intrude on that. So Dr. Watson, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell, aka DR.ABC. Good evening, everyone. As Dr. Campbell mentioned, my name is Kaschka Watson. So I will be talking to you a little bit today about how to disrupt and dismantle deficit thinking in schools through culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. So let me first share my screen, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I guess I have to bring up my deck.
Not seeing your deck as yet, Dr. Watson.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Good. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that's the wrong one. Okay. Are you seeing that now?
Not as yet. Now, yes.
Excellent. Let me see if I can move this over here. This is a great thing when you have double screens, you can manipulate the settings. So welcome again, everyone. You know, when Dr. Campbell asked me to be a guest speaker for one of his community courses, I was like, yes, sign me up. I'm ready to go. I'm always happy to talk to educators about how we all can collectively and both individually work together to change the discourse that we're hearing in our education system as it relates to students, and particularly relating to marginalized students in our education system, and how we can create those spaces where all our students are catered to in terms of working together to make them successful in our education system. So it's really a pleasure being here with you, just to steal some moments, some time from you, just to have some genuine conversations with you about how we can make our education system in Ontario and by extension in Canada great for all our students. And so with
Dr.
that.
Watson, just a quick jump in there. I think you need to do your slideshow because we're still seeing your note pages as well. So we
Okay,
want
let
to
me
start the
do.
slideshow so we don't see the note pages.
Excellent.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, wonderful. That's it. Yeah.
How are we now? Can you see?
Yeah. You're using double screen, so I think we are also seeing your other screen. So you need to share it so we only see the main screen.
All righty, let's see.
And this is fancy stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see, hold on.
So what we are seeing, we are able to see your up next slide, which is normally,
okay, yes.
If you're in person, it's normally hid, but we are seeing it now with the note pages as well. So you need to adjust it so we only see the slideshow only.
Okay, let me stop sharing and try that again. Sorry, everyone.
That's okay.
Okay. How is that?
Wonderful.
Is that
Go
better?
ahead. Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, so as I mentioned before, so Dr. Campbell and I wrote a book. So I think I'm on this next slide just to good. So we wrote a chapter in a book called Disrupting and Dismantling Deficit Thinking through Culturally Relevant and Responsive Pedagogy, right? And in this chapter, we spoke about some of the dangers of deficit thinking in our schools and how that impacts our students, how that impacts teachers, educators, and what are some of the things that educators can do to disrupt and dismantle deficit thinking in schools and create more inclusive classroom spaces for all our students so that they can achieve academic success. And so this book is entitled Leading for Equity and Social Justice, Systemic Transformation in Canadian Education. And those to the left there, you're seeing both editors for the book. And so in this chapter, this book actually comprised of 12 chapters ranging from topics focusing on transformative leadership all the way down to creating inclusive classrooms and being respectful and creating equitable learning spaces for students. So if you haven't already gotten a copy of this book, I highly recommend you get a copy. And not just to read the chapter that Dr. ABC and I wrote, but also to look at the other 11 chapters that are in the book, because there are some valuable gems available there that you can incorporate in your practice as educators. So really looking forward to seeing how you can all grow and benefit from this book as well. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about, so as Dr. Campbell mentioned, we're going to have 2 breakout sessions later on in the session. And this is just an opportunity for you to engage amongst yourselves and to discuss. And then we're going to take it back into the main, because I really want to hear from you as educators in terms of what are some of the things you can do to make your classroom inclusive, and how you're looking and seeing and viewing all your students and creating those learning spaces for them. Next slide. So before we get started, I want to set the context a little bit. And this is not because this is how we did it in the book. So in the book, we did provided some statistics on Canada's population, but I really want to show you the current state of Ontario's population and how that is impacting the school system right now as we're speaking. So the population of Canada, it's continuing to grow, right? And with that growth, we have diverse students entering in our classrooms from around the world, from different places. And because of that, we have to make spaces for them, and we have to make sure that we're doing um, teaching practices, and we're doing things that really incorporate their belonging in the classroom and how we're creating the spaces for that. So if you look on the slide, you'll see a comparison between the 2016 census as well as the 2021 census that was recently done. So you'll see that population is increasing year after year. And so as the population is increasing, so are our school systems are increasing. And so as educators, we have to figure out, how are we dealing with this diversity of students in our classroom? How are we catering to their needs? And we'll get into that a little bit more, but you'll see that the population for racialized and Indigenous pupils in Ontario, that has increased slightly. So for example, from the last census, it has increased, the population has increased for after the last 5 years. And then for whites, the white population in Ontario, you see a slight decrease in that by 5.1%. And then for the racialized group, you see an uptake increase in that at 5%, right? And then for the Indigenous population, it's 0.1%. So sharing this with you to make the case that as we live, as we're going every day, the population continues to increase, and we have to cater to that increase because we're seeing that diversity in our classrooms, and how are we making the space for that. So I just wanted to point out that statistics there, and then we'll move into the presentation. So in the book, we spoke about deficit thinking. And before we start defining deficit thinking, I'm going to ask at this time to just type in the chat box. When you hear deficit thinking, what are some of the deficit adjectives that comes to mind? So I'm checking the chat here, moving it over here. So I'm seeing inadequate assumptions, barriers, lowered expectations, gaps. Okay, excellent. So losing, inequity. Thank you so much for that. So these are some of the things that comes to mind when we talk about deficit thinking in our education system. So Dr. Campbell and I, there are several definitions to defining deficit thinking, but we really gravitated towards these two by Portelli and Cooney, and Gorski and Valencia. So for them, for example, Portelli and Cooney defines deficit thinking as privileging the norms of white middle class values while neglecting the importance of diverse perspectives. And for Gorski and Valencia, they define deficit thinking as any ideology that differs from the norm and is categorized as being less valuable and unworthy. And I like these two definitions because both of them speak about the dominant values that tends to drive our education system and drive society on the whole. What is deemed as the ways of doing things, ways of being, and how do we dismantle that? How do we challenge that dominant norm that creeps its way not only from society, but in our classroom and impact us as educators in terms of how we engage and interact and teach our students. And you know, at the beginning of the session, Dr. Campbell mentioned about we're taking care of people's children, right? And I think for many educators, they forget that sometimes that these children are in your responsibility. So for the little time that you have them before you in your classroom, they're in your care, and it's up to you to create those spaces where they feel that sense of belonging and feel that they can achieve anything. And we're going to get a little bit into that. So deficit thinking really looks at what is wrong with not just students, but what is wrong with people as a whole, right? So it looks at the negative of persons, and it's very pervasive in terms of how we use negativity to describe people. And some of that is stemming primarily from the fact that those are being driven by stereotypes and biases that we might have towards a particular culture or towards a particular group of individuals. And maybe because we don't know much about these individuals, and so because we don't know them well enough, we make assumptions, and all of us have biases, and they tend to creep up on us sometimes. So these are like short biases or shortcuts in our brains, right? That we tend to act upon. And later on in the session, you'll notice when I speak about culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, we look at how we examine our own biases as educators. So we'll get into that. So it's really, deficit thinking is really holding students with very low expectations, right? Thinking that something is wrong with them. This is not the way we do things. They're gravitating away from the norm. And so because they're doing that, then we need to do something to try to fix them perhaps. So these two definitions, I really like them because they really set the tone and they really give us some fundamental understanding of deficit thinking and how that impacts student and learning in the classroom. Next slide. So with deficit thinking comes a lot of dangers. So in the book, we spoke about some of the dangers of deficit thinking in schools and how that impact not just students, but also educators as well, and how educators who engage in deficit thinking makes the learning experiences for students unwelcoming and unachievable in some cases. So we talk about things like cultivating and exercising biases, stereotypes and prejudice or and assumptions. Many of these terminologies you mentioned in the chat just now of marginalized students. And I think one of the key things we need to understand and look at is how are we viewing students in the classroom, right? And what efforts are we making to ensure that we're teaching all our students and we're not looking at them through a deficit lens. So these stereotypes and biases, they end up become labels that we use to relate and to use of our students in the classroom. They become identifiers, and oftentimes these deficit thinking and mentality, what happens is that we're so entwined or entrenched in them that without knowing it, they end up creep and meander themselves into policies and practices in our classroom without even us knowing. Sometimes we're unaware because we have not engaged in that self-reflection, which I'm going to be talking about. So the next point is, with the dangers of deficit thinking, we tend to blame marginalized students for their failure or lack of academic success, if you want to use those terms. So if you have your students and you have the majority doing well and progressing, and you have a few, and those happen to be from marginalized communities, um, how are we making the space to challenge ourselves to say what is happening with these students? So for example, some of the deficit terminologies or adjectives that we might use is a student is unmotivated in the classroom, right? And so do we leave it at that? Do we try to find out why the student is unmotivated in class? Why he or she or they not participating in the classroom? Do we make that extra effort? And I think later on, when I start talking about culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, that's where we have to push ourselves as educators and really be intentional, because it's not easy work. You can't get up tomorrow morning and say, oh, I'm going to practice culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. It's something that takes time, and the changes that comes from that takes time as well. But you as an educator have to be intentional. So the other point is, we see marginalized students in our classroom as empty vessels or as broken vessels, something that needs to be fixed because they're not learning, they're not participating, they're not engaging in the teaching and learning process. And so we think that we need to fix them. We need to find something to mend them, if you want to use those terms. But we fail to look at the overarching educational system that is embedded with colonialism, right? And colonial ways of knowing and learning and being. And so because we're ingrained in that, we forget about the richness of these students' cultural diversity and how we can leverage those as strengths in our teaching and pedagogy in the classroom to make them feel welcome, to make students know that I am here for you, and this is how I'm going to support you to be successful. And the other point here is having low expectation, and I think a few of you mentioned that in the chat as well too. So deficit is really, as I mentioned before, it's looking at the wrong in someone or in students and looking at the low expectations of these individuals because they come from marginalized communities, from low socioeconomic background, for example, because their culture is differ from the dominant culture. We tend to have this low expectation of them, maybe because they're quiet in class or maybe because they're not engaging. We don't make the effort to figure out what is happening in these students' life. We don't make the effort to find out which communities they come from and how can I engage with that community to learn more about them. So we have very low expectation of these students, and students knows this. They know when their teacher cares about them and they know when they do not. And so if they're behaving this way, for example, and you as an educator are fuel into that in terms of not paying them any attention, you're catering to one set of student as opposed to the other, they recognize this and this further demotivates them and further add to the overarching lack of success in academia or in schools. So these are some of the things that um, we looked at in the book in terms of how educators are engaging in deficit thinking in school as they teach students. And so at this time, we're just going to quickly move into a quick breakout session, and we're going to look at how we dismantle deficit thinking in schools. So in your breakout session, I want you to discuss among yourself, how can Ontario schools create opportunities that can help to disrupt and dismantle deficit thinking. So think about that. And as educators yourself, think about the different ways we can dismantle deficit thinking in schools, and then we'll join back into the main group for a broader discussion. I want to hear from you. I want to hear you. Okay, I think we're all back now. Thank you so much. Okay, so can someone just quickly share from one of the group? I won't go to all the groups. I'm not sure how many there were, but I won't go through all the groups, but I'll share some of the insights from my group. But can someone share from one of the other group? What were some of the things you discussed in terms of how you can disrupt and dismantle deficit thinking in schools? Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Anybody wants to share?
I can jump on. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
go ahead. Yes, I can. Go ahead. Thank you.
So our group discussed providing students with leadership opportunities, whether that's in the classroom, in the school community, or their own community, so that they can be empowered to go against those narratives of the fact that they aren't capable of doing things. And we discussed the difference of what that would look like for high school students versus kindergarten students as they show leadership skills in different ways. So that was some of the stuff that we talked about.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else before we move on? Any other group wants to share? No. So in our group, our group raised some really interesting points, and I totally agree with all of them. For example, the focal point was on educators themselves. So putting the onus on educators, and it's up to the educators to make the difference and to really change their teaching and practices to disrupt and dismantle deficit thinking in schools. So for example, um, our group mentioned change comes with educators, and realizing that they have a role to play to affect students' education. And one of the things that I like about it, but what was shared in our group also, was that sometimes us as educators, we have deficit views about other educators as well too. And we also shared in our group that educators enter the classroom with these deficit views about students and about their peers, for example. And so it's something that it's an ideology or a philosophy of theirs that they think about. And so they enter the classroom with these negative um, deficit thinking views about students. And as a result, they impart that on students. And one of the things that we also mentioned before we move on is the fact that institution is not supportive in terms of providing educators with the tools and resources that they need to sometimes challenge the status quo. And so I was saying to the group that, yes, that might be the case, but as educators, we have to be innovative. We have to be creative in terms of how we're changing and altering our teaching and pedagogy to make sure that we're reaching and touching all our students. So even though you might not be getting adequate resources, you know the challenges your school is faced with. You know the challenges that exist in your classroom, and only you alone can create those changes. So some of the things that we can do to dismantle deficit thinking in schools is not look at marginalized students from a disadvantage view, which we often tend to do, but to look at the cultural richness that they bring to the classroom and to see how can I as an educator leverage those strengths, and how can I make sure that I'm creating the space where that student feel welcome and feel that sense of belonging in the classroom. So thank you so much for that, and we'll move on to the next slide. Let me see the chat here. Also, community circles and class and personal affirmations I find help too. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. Excellent. So next slide. So in the book we talk about, and this is where, as I mentioned, our group
Kaschka,
is,
we're not seeing your slides. So maybe you have to share back your screen. We're not seeing the slides.
no. Okay, let me see. Let me close this. And I'm not even seeing.
So you have to share back your screen. Yes, your screen.
Yeah.
Every time you come out from the breakout room, if it's share back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Righty. Let's do this. Bring this over here and let's put it in slide first. Share. Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So one of the things we spoke about in the chapter is educators engaging in authentic self-reflection. And I think this is key to dismantling deficit thinking in school. Oftentimes as educators, many of us, we don't really know who we are as educators. And so in the book, we spoke about really spending the time to engage into self-reflection. So the more you self-reflect, the more you learn a little bit more about yourself and how you can change your teaching and pedagogy to cater to the needs of all the students. So it's being aware of the diverse cultures of your students and their backgrounds and how they bring that into the classroom. It's creating a welcoming learning space for all your students so that they can achieve to their fullest potential. And what does that look like, right? It's really letting students know that you value them as individuals, you value their individuality as well, you value their culture, and this is how you're going to incorporate it in your learning space as educators. We talk about promoting inclusive practices and what that looks like, and it's really being committed as an educator to learn more about who your students are and what are their relationships, what are their intersectionalities, what backgrounds they're from, what communities they're from, and leveraging those in the classroom as you're teaching and educating them. And then we talk about examining power and privilege as an educator and examining ourselves and looking at our own biases and assumptions about marginalized students, because oftentimes we think that we don't have biases and we don't act on them. Many of us do. And I think through continuous self-reflection, we're able to really look in and to ensure that we're not actually tapping into our biases when we're engaging with not just students, but with our colleagues and with administrators within our schools as well too, because those can easily creep in and influence how we view and relate to students, parents, and their communities in our classroom. So it's all about changing your mindset. And I think we spoke a little bit about this in our group first breakout session about changing how you view students, how you view the educational system. And one of the things that I have challenges with is that, yes, we know that the education system is rooted in colonialism and colonial ways of doing, but what are we going to do about that? So oftentimes we tend to gravitate and linger on the problem itself, but how about thinking about ways to dismantle that problem and to tackle that problem in terms of making our classrooms more inclusive and equitable? So those are some of the things that educators can do to engage in self-reflection as they're re-examining themselves and learning more about themselves so that they can alter their teaching and pedagogy to cater to all students, right? And so this takes us into the foundations of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through the trajectory of how CRRP came into being. And in the next slide, we'll go a little bit through the definitions. So Gloria Ladson-Billings, she first coined the term culturally relevant pedagogy. And for her, at this time, she was looking at the school system in America and the US, and she realized that the education system wasn't fair and equitable for all students, and particularly for Black students, and how the educational system was failing them, right? And so through her research, she coined the term culturally relevant and pedagogy. And then 4 years or 8 years later, Geneva Gay looked at the literature and the work done by Gloria Ladson-Billings, and she nuanced that term and coined it as culturally responsive teaching. And as I mentioned before, we're going to get into the definition of those in the next slide. And then another 8 years later, Nicole Westburn, who's currently at OISE, University of Toronto, she looked at the literature for both Gloria Ladson-Billings as well as Geneva Gay, and she found them to be great in terms of tackling some of the social justice issues that are happening in our educational system. And so rather than looking at them separately, she amalgamated the two and formed culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And so from there, we've been using that term. And then in 2011, Richard Milner, he continued with the term culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And you'll see in the chapter, we have a comparison in terms of the outcomes that I'm going to be talking about, where we looked at Ladson-Billings, Geneva Gay, and Milner's CRRP outcomes for students and educators. I have 2023 with a question sign there. And one of the reasons why I put that there is because if you're not familiar with the realm of academia, these terminologies tend to change over time. And so we're currently in 2023. And so who knows, maybe myself or Dr. Campbell, we might come up with a new terminology, or another scholar might come up with a new terminology. But in any event, I want you to take away from this particular slide is that all of these scholars are saying the same thing, which is to incorporate students' cultural background and experiences in their learning and growth in the classroom. So I just wanted to share that with you. And so in terms of what is culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, so in 1992, Gloria Ladson-Billings defined it as recognizing the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of their learning. So what does that look like? So that's really using students' cultural knowledge, what they know, their backgrounds, their individual identities, personalities, and creating the space in the classroom where students can tap into that. And I think one of the challenges that educators often experience and having difficulty practicing or engaging in culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy is because they tend to focus more on the deficit aspect, where they look at what they don't know about the student more, as opposed to focusing on the strengths of what they know about the students and what they can know about the students in terms of getting to know who they are. The notes though. Oh, I'm just checking the chat here. Are we seeing the slides, or we're seeing the slides?
We're seeing the slide, but we're also seeing the notes one that we talked about before.
Okay.
Yeah, but you can proceed because your notes are extremely organized. Yeah, nobody ever see my notes because my notes are notes.
all over.
Are organized, right?
Yeah.
But continue, no problem.
So So yeah, so as I was saying, so Geneva Gay also defined culturally responsive teaching as really looking at the cultural characteristics and experiences and perspective of students in the classroom. So if you look at the trend in the definition of all of these terms, you'll see a key piece coming out time and time again: culture, experiences being incorporated in the classroom. And what does that look like in terms of culturally relevant, responsive teaching? That is really responding to students' goals and what they think about education, and finding out more about how they want to be a part of the learning process and creating that space for them. And then West Burns defined culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy as really exploring how educators view students, how they understand them, how they interact with them and engage with them, and how they tie that into the classroom as they're teaching students from diverse culture. And then Milner, he continued with the term, as I mentioned, but he looks at how it empowers students about what they are learning and enables them to challenge inequities in society. So when you empower students about their culture and make them feel good about their culture and create that space where you're tapping into their culture within the classroom, how you're creating and being innovative as an educator and making sure that the cultural nuances of the different students that you cater to are embedded in the curriculum or altering the curriculum to display that, students are more motivated, they're more calm, they're more able to share, they feel like you care, they feel a sense of belonging in the classroom. And then by doing that, you're empowering them to look at the social issues that are happening, not just in the education system, but in society, and getting them to understand that there are systemic barriers that exist in society and in the educational system, and what can I do to disrupt that?
Dr. Watson, before you jump
Yes.
into the next slide, there is a very important comment in the box, and I want to bring everybody's attention to it from Fazia. Fazia is someone who works heavily in equity at the York Region District School Board. I've worked with Fazia before, and I want to, and you actually did share with the group that there will be more voices and more terminologies. And I just want us to know that Dr. Goldie Mohammed, actually someone I met in person at ARA this year, has a whole lot to say, and is the newest and go-to voice in this conversation. So all of us at the University of Toronto in the Masters and the MEd, and the MA and the MT program, who is looking at culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, the conversation is expanding, and right now it's expanding with a powerful voice of Dr. Goldie Mohammed. So I just want to add that name to the list, so you can continue. Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for that. Next slide. So Gloria Latzo-Billings raised three major tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy in her research, and it's high expectation, cultural competence, and students engage in critical consciousness or critical cultural consciousness, if you want to use that as well. So what does high expectations mean for our students? And having high expectations for all our students, not just some, not just the students who are doing well, but the students who are perhaps struggling. How do we enter the classroom as educators and having that high expectations of all our students? And it's believing that all our students can succeed, all our students can attain academic success. And for me, believe is a very powerful word, because it's powerful, because when you believe in something, you're motivated because of that belief. You're confident because of what you believe in, and you're also empowered because of that belief. So it's believing that all students can attain academic success, and the onus is on the educators to create that space for students. So it's really understanding the diverse differences that exist among students in terms of their intersectionalities, and how are you altering or leveraging their strengths and changing your teaching and pedagogy to ensure that you're reaching and teaching all students and making them feel welcome in the classroom. And then the differences in terms of cultural differences for me is also beautiful in the sense that differences provides us as educators with options. When you have difference, and if you use it, if you put that in the example of diverse students in your classroom, you have a classroom that is rich with knowledge and culture and different backgrounds. And you're not just seeing one culture, you're not just hearing one perspective, you're hearing different perspectives. It's like when you go, for me, I love colors. So when I go to the store to purchase a shirt, I have to purchase, if I'm buying 3 or 4 shirts, it have to be different colors, right? So difference provides us as educators with options to really alter our teaching and our pedagogy. And it also provides us with opportunities because you have a lot more to choose from. And because of those opportunities, it forces us or encourages us to be innovative in our practice. So those are some key points I want to relate. So it's having those high expectations for all our students. And then the other point is helping students to develop cultural competence. And what does that look like? So it's creating the space that foster diversity of all your students. So you're really tapping into their culture and allowing students to share their culture in the classroom. So as they're learning about other students' culture, other students are learning about their culture as well. And how do you leverage that and create that space? And I know in our group, briefly, someone, I think it was Andrew, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew mentioned about some schools, they don't provide, for example, opportunities for educators to provide different cultural texts to be used in schools and so on. And I think we also discussed that again. It's really up to the educators to really make that extra step and to take risks and to really be intentional about their action, to say, you know what, they haven't provided me with this resource, but I am going to purchase this resource and I'm going to bring it in the classroom and I'm going to teach my students because it is important. So it's being intentional. And then the last point there is creating that critical consciousness. And again, it's creating that brave space where students can push back and challenge the dominant culture in society because they're more aware. They know more about what's happening. They know more about the systemic challenges that are happening in school and how that is impacting them. And so they're best positioned to push back at the dominant culture. So they're developing that critical consciousness where they're examining how they're being taught in schools and how they're being reacted to in schools as well, and pushing back against the dominant narrative that is mostly from a Eurocentric perspective. And then I think we move into our next.
Before we go into the next breakout room, Kaschka, and for those who maybe not aware, Kaschka and I discussed that I will address the questions in the chat. And so there are 2 questions in the chat that I would take on to address. There's actually a comment from Sarah and James Vaughn, and then we go to the, there's a question at the top there. Okay, I think I missed there's a question that was asked earlier. Okay, I see it, Emily. So Emily, I see what happened. Somebody responded to you and it collapsed the question. That's by the way, that's what Zoom is doing now. Zoom, it's new in Zoom that you can now respond to a comment somebody make earlier and it will collapse it down. So Emily asks, does CRRP apply to education systems that are of minority cultures? And I want to answer this very, very important and quickly, because when we talk about CRRP, especially on this side of the pond in Canada, we forget that CRRP added as its beginning with Gloria Latsabili, which is an American context in American school system. And it was CRRP was a response to us, to racialized students, specifically Black students not doing well. So CRRP, when I lecture about it, is a liberatory pedagogy. It is a abolitionist pedagogy. It is a pedagogy that says, I am going to create opportunities for learning that are specific to racialized bodies. But so the answer is, it's not just for a school system that are of minority culture. It's for all school systems, but it is an empowering practice that looks at minority culture, look at differences, look at Global South, as we say, look at Black, as we say, look at Indigenous people and people of color, and say, how do we make sure their voices are not erased? And and I'm sure everybody may be watching what's going on in Florida as we speak. There's a lot of news, especially out today, when they pass a new rule today as we speak, where what her name is, the young lady Amanda Gorman, that presented at that was the poet laureate for Biden. Her poems are now blocked, are now illegal to be spoken, are out of schools in Florida. So we see what's going on. So we see the idea that your identity is culturally relevant, responsive. Your identity, who your students are, culture, customs, ways of knowing is embedded in school in an intentional way. We are now seeing what's happening in the reverse in some places where they are going back to erasure. If you look on the news, you see the number of books that have been taken out of Florida schools, and all the book banning, thank you, Deborah, the censorship and the anti-wokeness is, as you said, as you asked Emily, it's about other cultures. So that's what I want to answer. The second question before we go into our breakout room for about 5 minutes, we won't do 10, is how do you address the concept of culture for second? Very good question, Saran. How do you address the concept of culture for second and third generation Canadians who may not necessarily feel a strong connection to their heritage? And Pella, you said, ask them what culture they identify with. So we have to remember, when I said to you in another space, I said, when people say, tell me about the Black experience, there's no one Black experience. Tell me about the gay experience. There's no one gay experience. Tell me about what it is to be poor. There is no one poor experience. There is no one white experience, rich experience, Jewish experience, there's no one experience. And so what we have to do is, this is why we talk about getting to know your student. What does that look like? It looks like conversations. It looks like building. I don't use the word getting to know anymore. I use relationships. Because if I see Jennifer and I see Andrew Gillette on the cake, all I see for Andrew, I see Andrew is another Black man. But I get to know Andrew. I know who Andrew is at another level. And that impacts who we are. So you are absolutely right with this concept that we may go to a school and, for instance, say as child, let me use a perfect example, somebody who is hijab wearing, and then you realize that the girl who sits beside the hijab wearing girl is also Muslim, but she does not wear a hijab. You have to understand. So here is a trick. Both can exist. And we need to allow both to exist. The problem is when we do that, we question culture. So the same deficit and issues, it transcends in so many other ways. Well, you're not real Black. Have you heard that? You're not real Jamaican. You're not real. Have you heard those kind of conversations we use? And I've heard it in gesture, but we have to understand when it comes to culture, we have to understand. And culture also shifts. Culture also transcends. And culture is also, that's why we talk about community, because someone has to carry the culture. And that's why many cultures have been erased, because when the elders don't have any space, see, I don't want to bring in all of that now, because it's going to take you another 2 hours. When the elders do not have any space, culture is in danger. So whenever you see a bunch of young people and everybody want to be fly and do their own thing, you have to remember this. If there's no elder among you to say, this is how we do it, we are in trouble. Because you cannot create new culture. Culture is passed down. Culture is transferred. Culture is kept and preserved and delivered. And that is why there is so many, cultural preservation. You answer your own question. And that is why sometimes we are in trouble, especially as racialized folks. When the new people think, well, why are we talking about slavery? I'm free. And you don't understand who you are. And then all of a sudden, we see you enacting in spaces where you are so trapped, you don't even realize what you're doing to yourself because we do not have a sense of cultural preservation. So you are right. It's opening. It's moving down. Absolutely. 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 I see your comment there, Deborah. Very personal, but very, very related. Yeah. You are not Black. We have heard that before. You are not Black. So what is culture? We have to, those are nuances that we'll get into. So I think Dr. Watson, you wanted to go into you want to lead us into that breakout room, and we come back in about 6 minutes and the wrap up. And then we can
Yes, so
any questions. Go ahead.
thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. So we'll just take 5 minutes for this breakout session. And I just want you to discuss amongst yourself, what does a CRRP classroom look like for you?
Your mic is off, Dr. Watson. Your mic is off.
Yeah, sorry about that. So as I was saying that I won't ask everyone to share, but I'll just share 2 pieces from our group that is really impactful. And again, the conversation centered around educators in the classroom and their roles and responsibilities and what they ought to do and should do to create that space where they're creating that inclusive and equitable environment for everyone. So we talk about educators addressing the inherent biases that they have, right? And how they can easily tap into those biases and view and look at students differently. It's reflecting on their action as opposed to just doing equity work for the sake of equity work. You know, there's a lot of buzzword with inclusion, diversity, and equity. So are we just doing that to, let's say, tick a box? Or are we really caring about our students and making sure that we're creating those learning environments where they feel welcome and supported to excel and grow? And another key thing that you raise is the fact of looking at engaging in self-reflection, as we mentioned, and looking at how some of the things that we do as educators can be traumatizing or trauma-informed towards some of our racialized students. So being very conscious of that and being very careful in terms of what you incorporate in your pedagogy and practice as an educator so that you're not re-traumatizing students. And through self-reflection, you're able to examine that and think about that before you make any changes or implement any nuances to your curriculum, right? Can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, so next slide is, so in the book, we looked at the outcomes of what a culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy looks like. And this is why I had that activity before this, because I wanted to hear from you as educators. What are your thinking process? What are some of your thought processes? And as you can see, we compared Ladson Billings, Gay, and Milner's outcomes of what educators can do to make their classroom culturally relevant and responsive, right? And so you'll see the 3 tenets there that Gloria Ladson-Billings spoke about, which is holding students to high expectations, cultural competence, and socio-political consciousness or critical consciousness. So for her, it's really creating spaces where students believe that they can attain academic success. And I think we all know as educators that at the end of the day or at the end of the school term or year or whatever, All students are not going to be at the same place, but the overarching goal is to ensure that all students are successful at the end of the term or at the end of the academic year. So it's up to us as educators to really incorporate and alter in our assessments, alter in our teaching practices to make sure that we're catering to the needs of all our students. And for GAY, in terms of outcomes for culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, GAY centers that on the whole student. So again, looking at the cultural aspects, the complexities that are involved with cultural identity and how identity in and of itself is complex within our schools and a part of our students' lives and experiences. And how are we gauging that and incorporating the cultural differences that exist in terms of where students are coming from, the communities, their parents, right? And how are they impacting their education system? So it's really decolonizing the curriculum so that it's not Eurocentric, but it's more equitable because you're creating those spaces where students have that sense of belonging. And Milner, he spoke about empowering students to really tackle and disrupt the dominant narrative and incorporating their cultures in the classroom and really creating that space where they're challenging the status quo. So as they're learning and growing as students, they're able to tap into their culture. They're able to um, feel great within themselves as students in terms of how am I incorporating this in my learning process. And so you're providing that opportunity where students are actually able to feel comfortable and great about learning and how they feel like their educator or their teacher cares about their learning and their growth in the classroom. So these are some core outcomes that we spoke about in the book, and we compare these three because they have a lot of similarities. And I think the overarching goal is really to incorporate the culture of the students in the classroom and to make students be aware of that, right? So, and one thing I wanted to point out is that oftentimes as educators, sometimes we think that we're only educators and we're not learners. So we're both learners and educators. So we learn from our students. So when we create those spaces where students can tap into their culture and pull things from their experiences into the classroom, and we probe and we get to learn more about who our students are, we are also learning more about them. And by learning more about them, we're best positioned to teach them better and to create learning activities and spaces where they can really be engaged in their the learning process, right? So the more you learn from them, the more they learn from you as well. And so in terms of moving forward as educators, we spoke a little bit about what educators can do to move forward by practicing culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. And in our group, I briefly mentioned to our group that it sounds easy. These are all great things that educators can do. And these are some brilliant things that educators should do. But it's hard because a lot of educators were not willing to take that risk, right? And so you have to be willing to take the risk. You're going to get some pushback, and you have to be able to tackle that and grapple with that, because you know that you're doing the right thing. You know that this is a different way of teaching and learning and growth for your students. And so you are making the first step to create those opportunities. So it's really creating a class that somewhat exits outside of the school setting. So you're tapping into their cultures and their experiences outside of the classroom, learning more about where they come from, and so how you can use that in your teaching and assessments. I spoke about taking risk, right? So it's caring and seeing your students and the strengths that they bring into the classroom. And here I have refrained from using a one-size-fits-all approach. So I'm referring to the standardized testings and curriculum that we have in our education system. And we have been doing this for years. Now it's time to change that. And how are we making the efforts to change that by creating more inclusive classrooms and recognizing the dangers of deficit thinking, how it's impacting students, how it's impacting you as an educator, how it's impacting parents and the communities that these students come from, and what you can do to ensure that you're making sure that students feel that sense of belonging and they're more ingrained and they're more engaged in the learning process. And then the final point is being intentional. And I think Dr. Campbell likes to use this word, and it's a very powerful word, and it's a very meaningful word, because as educators, you have to be intentional. Nobody's going to do it for you. You have to say, I want to make the change. I want to see the change. I want all my students to be successful, and here is how I'm going to do it. Yes, I'm going to perhaps get some pushback here from administrators within my schools or from the education system overall, but this is what I am doing because it's the right thing to do. So it's really engaging again in that self-reflective practice where you're examining your power and privileges and how those biases are interconnected and how they alter the privileges that you have, which can translate into you taking actions that create barriers for a particular group, right? So how are you examining yourself and making sure that you're catering to all your students? So with that said, I'll wrap it up. So thank you so much for listening. And I've had some great discussions with my group. I hope you all experience the same in your respective group as well. And just bear in mind that this is a constant journey in terms of whether or not you choose to take a culturally relevant and responsive approach, because it's not something that can be done overnight. It's something that requires gradual work moving forward.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Watson. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And we are literally right on time with 20 seconds to go. And thank you so much. And I see some new faces. I see you. I see you. I see the inbox messages. I see you. I see you. I see your personal message. I see community. And that's how we grow. And when Dr. Watson talk about learning from and with each other, that is something I practice a lot, how I learn from each other. And I always say, I come with so many great ideas because I've heard it somewhere before. There's nothing new under the sun. And let us, if culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy is a good example of that, seeing where it came from with Gloria Latz-Billings and seeing where it's at and realizing there are new voices like Goli Muhammad and other voices I know actually who are doing work in this area. So that is what it is about. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Dr. Watson, could you stop sharing your screen? It's a pleasure, everyone, to have you a part of my community class series. It's over. I'm done tonight. It's the last of that. We'll have it again in the fall. So for those who don't know what I do, I teach here at the University of Toronto. My personal commitment to community, to the world, to learning, to unlearning, to engaging, because I know that even to tell people how to disrupt and to unpack is also access again, who gets to go to the workshop. And I've lived over the last 4 years with so many emails with somebody say, is that workshop free? Is that workshop open? Can I go? And they see me on flyers? And I realize there's a need. And I know for a fact that no matter how many times you get an opportunity to speak to people in spaces that are only reserved for certain group of people, I want to make sure part of my legacy is that I've created space for everyone. And what I've done here intentionally is not to give my master's degree students all of this good stuff and then I give the community the leftover. So what I decided to do when I got interviewed for this very job is that I sell them on, I have the slide where I sold the idea of having community in my class in very intentional ways. And it's not going to stop. So come fall, I'll be teaching 5708. That is my course for Black students only. But the community class is not open to Black people on it, open to everybody. And if you have been to my 5708 last week, I know you was there, Angie Gillette. I know you was there, Sabi. I see you. I see you. I see you. What a time. What a time. It took me days to finish thinking about the things that I learned from Kimberly Cato and Sharon and Sherry Daniels and also Ophelia. And then the week before, I want you to know I have contacted principal from York, Peel, Francine. And I was like, listen, we need to have a conversation. I want to write something about carrying the water. It's not left me yet. Anybody was there when she talked about carrying she said, my job is to carry water. I literally could write an entire chapter on it. It was so powerful. So I got stuff, and I know you are getting stuff. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. And if you leave here tonight with more questions than answers, do not say, damn, I have more questions. That is great that you have more questions, because we live in a society where we very think we have a question, somebody must answer, and then we move on. And then we only realize we are not well, we are not healed, we are not okay, we are not full, because what we keep doing is only just a fill up. And so one of our students, Sonia, presented this afternoon, and she talked about how many questions she still have, and that now she has opened, this course has opened an entire ocean. And I said to her, keep on swimming, Sonia. You're not drowning. You are here. I can see you. I see you, Sonia. You look like you're going on the beach later. Keep swimming. We're not drowning, but that is what we do. We bring ourselves to the work. We bring ourselves to the work. There's so much to learn about CRRP. So much to learn. People are messing it up because they're thinking, oh, let's find a Black book and read. Let's read about, we have a child. Oh, one of you in the group I heard said it. Oh, we have 3 Black boys. Oh, let's get a hip hop song. Did you ask the Black boys if they like hip hop? Because I don't like hip hop. I like what her name is, R&B. I'm a Whitney Houston Fantasia kind of person. Like, I don't want no hip hop, but I'm Jamaican, but I like dancehall. I like head top music. Oh, I like head top music, as we call it back out, skin out music. Oh yeah, that is not me being anything. That is proper skin out music. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. This is how we do it. Okay, this is Sarah and James Vaughn, teacher. You glad you come to this class? You better come back.
Very glad.
Listen,
Teams.
Listen, I love you all. I love your community, and thank you for sharing in this. Thank you again, Dr. Watson, for being our special guest this evening. And I want to thank everyone who participated in our series. In the fall, like I said, I'm teaching 5708. And they're doing 2 community classes in the evening, just like this, on a Wednesday evening. So block your 2 Wednesdays. When you hear about it, I'll tell you. And I'm going to teach a class in the day, anti-discrimination, on a Tuesday morning. And I open that class as well for 2 community classes. So I'll either put those classes online, or I'll have the class in person at OISE, and I'll broadcast online for those who want to be a part of those classes. I love you all. I love you all. I love you all. This is a wonderful evening. The sun is not gone, and I just said, go take a little walk. I'm going to take a little walk to live my best life, so I could show up. I could show up during Pride celebration, snatched and ready to go. But like they said on Instagram today, whatever body you have when summer reach, that is your body. Whatever body you have when summer reaches, that is your body. I want you to live your best life. I want you to enjoy who you are and love who you are. Because no pay me no mind walk. When I come back, I'm eating. I have 2 dumplings, 3 banana, a piece of yam, and some ackee and salve from yesterday. So maybe the walk is not even any use, because I'm going to eat my food. You bet believe I'm going to eat my food. So Jennifer, I know you love this class. Bethel, what amazing. What a session. I love you all. Continue to grow, continue to question yourselves, and continue to have a desire to be the best teacher you can be. I am not the best teacher in the world, but I can tell you, I love teaching. I love people's children. And when I go to school, my job is to make sure I teach well. And I want to pass this on to you as well. That's in your statement. All right. Love you all. Okay, I'm going to go for my walk and come back eat my ackee and salvage and my dumpling and banana. And by the way, just so you know, Gillette, there's cassava in the dumpling. You better get your life together. There's cassava in the dumpling. What's going on over here, Dr. ABC? What is going on? Have a good evening, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good evening, everyone.